typically when you have a FHIR server, it has to support or serve multiple purposes. And those requirements are different based on the service that you need to provide. So for example, you might have a FHIR server that is supporting patient access API, and that will have probably more transactions hitting it, smaller transactions, no batch transactions, for example. It needs to be a secured endpoint. You may have a second purpose for the same FHIR server, but a different endpoint, which is the provider directory endpoint. And for provider directory, it's a non-secured endpoint. It has a specific subset of data, so it will have filtering and a limited number of APIs available compared to the patient access API. And you may have, for example, another endpoint talking to the same FHIR server ultimately, which issues for internal integration purposes. So you may have batch updates from your backend systems going into your FHIR server on a nightly basis. You may have other integration endpoints that are talking to your FHIR server to your backend systems. That they all have different requirements, which means you need to have different endpoints for each of the services that you're offering, and they also have different sizing and monitoring requirements. So, for example, your patient access API may be being used by 10,000 or 100,000 different patients or members on a daily basis, whereas the internal FHIR endpoint is processing a single batch transaction overnight and only needs resources to support that one transaction for that short period of time. So the ability to define your scaling and your infrastructure. You also don't necessarily want to have detailed transaction level monitoring against all of your batch transactions that are going on through your internal integration endpoint, but you certainly want to have more fine-grained control monitoring, maybe even transaction counting against your patient API. For example, the CMS requires you to have a count of how many unique patients have accessed their data and how often that endpoint has been used.